Welcome to Inside IR, a podcast series by Herbert Smith Freehills that explores the latest developments in Australian industrial relations law and practice.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Inside IR, the Australian Industrial Relations podcast. This is the series that arms HR, IR and legal professionals with the latest in industrial relations thinking. My name's Drew Pearson. I'm a partner here at Herbert Smith Freehills in the Employment and Industrial Relations practice, and I'm joined by Natalie Gaspar.
Hello, Drew.
Great to have you here.
As always, and on your birthday. Happy birthday, birthday boy.
Why, thank you. And later in the episode, we'll hand over to Wendy Fauvel and Rommo Pandit from our team, who will take you into some of the more detailed elements of what we know at this very early stage of the 2025 Australian federal election campaign. And that is the topic of today's episode. We're going to look at what we know now about the issues that may become areas for reform following the election, whoever may form government. To do that, Nat and I initially will take a bit of a look at the landscape of the political system as we head into the election to see what change will be required and what we can learn from past elections and past parliaments that might give us an insight as to the reforms that do come through. Of course, winning government in the lower house is only one part of the formula here. The Senate will play a key role in any legislative reform that comes through. Now, I might hand over to you now, Nat, to just take us through some of those electoral basics.
A brief history lesson I think is worthwhile because what we learn from the history I think is really important in predicting what we might anticipate for this election and what we need to watch for. So I think it's worth noting for our listeners that we're filming this just as the election's been called, and so we have populated on our website a election hub where you can stay up to date on latest developments because of course things are moving almost daily in this space, Drew. So let's go back to 2004. So that was when the Howard government was returned in quite a convincing fashion. And despite what a lot of people think, the Work Choices platform wasn't actually part of the Howard government's election platform. So that happened a year later whilst that government was in power, and of course very profound changes to the industrial relations framework at that time. But the point, Drew, is that that was not part of that government's election mandate at that time. We fast forward to 2007, and that was the era of the K-Rudd challenge, K-Rudd era, and that in fact was an election campaign which was highly focused on industrial relations. So Kevin Rudd, then in opposition, was running very, very vocal, and you might remember at the time all the election campaigns and ad material really focusing to your kind of working class Australians about the dangers it was, expressed as of Australia's work choices system which was put in place at the time. Of course, there were a number of other issues that the Rudd government, then in opposition, had on its election platform, but certainly the repeal of work choices was a major one. Then we fast forward to just 3 years ago, although I must say it feels like just yesterday we were talking about election platforms and issues and reforms. So that was when the Albanese government was in its election campaign mode. And you might recall that there was some discussion at that time about what it wanted to do in an industrial relations landscape. So it was talking about increasing wages for Australians as quickly as possible, reigniting collective bargaining at the workplace level, gender equality and transparency. So those kind of key election platform mantras was discussed, but I think it's fair to say that that wasn't really a referendum on industrial relations.
Absolutely
when
not.
that government formed. So very quickly, you might recall, when that government formed, there was the Jobs Summit, the Skills and Jobs Summit, where representatives from both business and unions and government came together and discussed some of these issues, and that translated to the government's white paper on jobs and skills and reform. And I think it's interesting to just paint that history, Drew, because I think, again, this time around, we are not heading into an election. You are not going to be holding a democracy sausage on election day at the booths, effectively voting on which party's IR campaign you prefer. And as we've seen in the last previous elections, the vote of the independents and the Teals and the Greens, I think, is going to be really critical in terms of any future IR reform. And we can see, for example, even more recently, the right to disconnect, that wasn't an amendment that was, of course, part of the Labor government's platform, and that is now part of the laws that we face. So I might just pass back to you, Drew, to give our listeners a bit of an overview of the importance of those minor parties and the independents.
I think that's a great point, Nat, because, of course, the rise of the independents, and particularly highlighted by the Teal independents, being a collection of independents. You know, they are not a political party. They have similar views on many things. They have very disparate views on other topics. And you'll see throughout the election campaign, I think, that the government and the opposition will each talk to which independents they will deal with in quite specific terms. So we'll see that kind of unfold over the coming weeks as we head through to May the 3rd. Now, of course, every member of the lower house will be seeking election at this upcoming election. But in the Senate, we have just a half Senate election. So there's 76 seats in the Senate, and of that, 38 are up for election. Now, interestingly, it's a fairly even split as to the numbers of seats currently held across the majors and the independents. So we've got 13 Labor senators, 15 coalition senators, 6 from the Greens, and then 4 from the minor parties and independents who are seeking re-election. Now, I think what's interesting there is it's roughly half of the coalition and Labor's senators. So going into this, we're not seeing what John Howard's government obtained in 2004, which was a double majority, being they had a majority in the Senate, meaning they could pass laws of their own right. They did not need to do deals. And it's something that we've seen governments, certainly through the last 10 years, having to make deals with the minor parties, the Greens, in their own right, in order to get legislative reform through. And so I think what we will see this time round again is likely that neither party will have a majority in both houses. And the minors in the Senate will be important, and that brings us to the House of Representatives. Now, there's a lot of talk at the moment that we may not see a majority government formed. We may be taken back to the election when we had the last minority government formed in this country, where there were days of negotiations between Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard, being the two leaders of the major parties seeking to form a government. Ultimately, that was done with the support of 4 independents. And we saw throughout that term of government that the views of those independents took on a greater kind of force than they otherwise would as an independent in the parliament. So in the lower house, we will see either a majority government formed by Labor or the coalition, or the potential for a minority government. Now, in the event of a minority government, what we have this time that we did not have 10 years ago are these more high-profile independents, the Teal independents, who will place certain emphasis on issues that are key to their hearts, environment obviously being one of the key drivers there, and you can see talk out of the major parties as to who they will and won't kind of seek to form a minority government with, should that play out. Of course, we are in the first week of the election, and it really is anyone's game at this point in time. I think overall what that means is that no one is going to be able to come into government and swiftly move to bring in major reforms. I think we will see a similar process to last time, where whoever wins government will take stock, start looking at the types of issues that they want to progress in the workplace space, and probably engage in some form of consultation, perhaps at that very public level like we saw with the Albanese government last term, but also perhaps quite informal.
Yeah.
So that probably gives us a good basis of the landscape and what the political realities of this campaign are likely to be, and what the mechanics of any reform will require. As we head into the second half of 2025, we'll hand over to Wendy and Rommo now, who will take you through some of the more specific details of platforms and policy positions that we are currently aware of.
Thanks so much, Drew and Nat. Now, Rommo, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specifics. So, look, I think it's certainly going to be a bit of an uncertain time as to what we're going to get in the next term of government. Are we going to get, kind of further entrenching of the various changes that have been made by the Albanese government over the last couple of years, or are we going to see the unravelling of them? So with uncertainty, I guess, comes a bit of fear. But what do you think, Rommo? Where are you seeing this?
Fear is probably a big one, especially around election time. Probably two main areas that I wanted to touch on when it comes to fear and change. One's around whistleblowing. So whistleblowing, we're seeing an increase in claims. We have been over the last couple of years. I think employees who are making those sorts of complaints are actually seeing change when they're made. And so that's definitely given rise to an increase in whistleblowing claims. And there are a couple of changes that will probably kickstart that even more. One's around, the ACTU has been talking about potentially giving bounties. I think they kind of raised that a few years ago. And I think if that does come through, that's going to increase claims even more than what we're saying. And the other change is around an independent whistleblower authority. So there's a bill before the Senate at the moment. And I think if that ends up going through, it's going to give complainants a bit more comfort that they have support processes in place. And so they won't face things like victimization, which is often a concern that complainants have in the whistleblowing space. So if you've got an independent authority looking out for them, that will give whistleblowers a lot more confidence in bringing those claims. I think if those changes do come through, a few things really practically to keep in mind. We kind of operate with three golden rules here at Freehills when we deal with whistleblower complaints. One is don't do nothing, which sounds obvious, but sometimes it's easy to put things in the too hard basket if you're a recipient of a whistleblower claim. Get consent. That often solves a lot of the problems that companies have in the space. By getting consent to disclose identity, you avoid a lot of traps. And the last one is don't victimize, which goes without saying. The other one, when we talk about kind of fear, a relatively recent announcement is around the banning of non-competes. Already seeing a lot of articles on that. I think on that, look, it's following a global trend around non-competes. For me, practically, I don't think from an enforcement of non-compete perspective, we're going to see that much change. The reality is they're really expensive things to do or enforce. And so we typically don't see them enforced against lower income earners anyway. However, one thing that I might expect to see is, is there a change in remuneration structure? If the cutoff is around the high income threshold, we're probably seeing a little bit of that in the modern award space, with employees giving high income guarantees, probably tweaking structures where employees are receiving a higher amount of variable comp by increasing base pay. So we might see that if there's a real, for certain industries, if there's a need to enforce non-competes, by paying employees a fixed salary above the high income threshold. So those are the two main areas. And I guess competition's always been an interesting one for me, especially when it comes to something like multi-employer bargaining. What are you seeing in the multi-employer space?
I think, look, there's obviously been a sweeping set of changes to our system already in the last couple of years. I guess what I'm kind of envisaging, the ALP hasn't come out and said that they will do this, but certainly there's a push from the ACTU to further make tweaks to the laws that we've seen already to make it easier for unions and employees to get the orders that they need. So two spaces, two key things in bargaining, I guess. The new provision around unions being able to start the notification time by giving an employer notice. If they do that, there's a limit around that at the moment, that the enterprise agreement in question that's old can't be no more than 5 years post nominal expiry date. The proposal of what ACTU are pushing for is to remove that. So again, for employers already agreeing to bargain, maybe not such a big change because they were already going to start. It, of course, might impact their ability to do that in their own time. But for some employers, for instance, in the Pilbara, who haven't been bargaining for a long time, this sort of change would have a big effect. So that sort of change. The other kind of minor tweaks might be to things like multi-employer bargaining. Now, again, ALP haven't come out and said this, but the ACTU are pushing this pretty hard, trying to make it easier to get to an order for multi-employer called single interest employer authorisation, trying to get an authorisation quicker. So for instance, the ACTU are saying it's really administratively inefficient for us to go and get petitions to get the majority of employees for each employing entity. It takes a lot of time for us to do that before we head into the commission. We want to get that removed. Now, if that's removed, again, it's an easier way for them to file applications and get matters in front of the commission quicker and hopefully get to an order quicker. So little tweaks, little changes, massive impact. And that's just, I guess, two examples of what the ACTU are pushing. Certainly really complex time in IR at the moment. It's really hard to get agreements up with cost of living pressures, wages expectations. We're seeing a real push towards compliance, which means, more important than ever, thinking about what's on the page in bargaining is really important to making sure your systems and your processes line up with the words on the page. But what about in the compliance space, Rommo? Like, what sorts of proposals are we seeing in this space from the ALP?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because we've seen over the last few years with underpayments, that whole notion of having processes, systems in place, teams talking to each other. It's become really important, and often enterprise agreements are bargained without inputs from all stakeholders, and it may work from one perspective and then suddenly payroll says we can't actually practically do what the enterprise agreement says. And a couple of spaces that are going to be relevant coming up probably in the next year or two. One's around payday super. So it's been on the cards for a little while, where there's been talk around making the obligation to remit super payable on payday. Currently it's obviously quarterly. Sounds simple enough, and from a legal perspective, we might think, okay, well, that's just easy, just change the day on which it's paid. But the lead time to implementing payroll change, talking to your tax team, that takes a long time, and I've seen a lot of that. You often think it's quick, but it can take 12, 18 months for relatively simple systems fixes. So that's a big one that I think clients need to get onto early, because I think in legal we think it's straightforward, and I don't think it will be from a payroll perspective. The other one, again, there's been a bit of talk around this for a while, is around privacy and the employee records exemption. Again, following some of the activity in the UK around changes in privacy laws. Currently, it's relatively easy. I mean, there are still limits, but employers rely on the employee records exemption to exempt themselves for various privacy obligations. There has been discussion around removing that. If that happens, it's going to change the processes around employee engagement. We might need to get additional consents from employees in terms of what to do with their private data. It's going to affect the use, storage, handling, and disclosure of information. Probably, and both payday super may well require consultation with employees, because they could amount to major changes that are going to need to be made to systems. So those are a couple of changes in the compliance space that we just need to keep an eye out for. And again, on the topic of consultation, I know there's discussion around changing the consultation provisions in awards and instruments. Yeah,
I mean, there's a real push from the union movement to have a couple of key changes. So not the long-standing consultation provisions around definite decision to introduce major change. There's a real push to make that proposed change, which is, of course, before a decision is made. And also, there's a lot of push around AI and these sorts of technologies, and putting increased kind of positive duties on employers to really go out of their way and make sure that employees are part of that process. So at the moment, I think the Albanese government left this with the Commission to determine. The Commission recently changed the model clauses but didn't tweak the definite decision to introduce major change concept. But certainly it's before them again later in the year. So we'll have to see where the Commission lands. But certainly I think we're going to see more activity, I'm suspecting, and this has come out through some of the AI Senate committees into looking at how we regulate AI. The push towards, consulting with employees at an earlier stage, making them part of the process, giving some kind of minimum standards or guidelines for what genuine consultation is. I think we're going to see there's a lot more expectation of employers in that space at a far earlier stage than making a definite decision, which is quite difficult to manage.
And it'll affect, I guess, employers differently, because a lot of EAs will already have that. But for my clients, certainly, for the most part, they're currently stuck with the kind of traditional definite decision. And if the kind of point of consultation is brought ahead, that's a pretty big change.
It is. I think we've talked a lot already about some of the things that the ACTU are proposing, what the ALP are proposing. There's only a couple of things. When you look at the long shopping list that we had last time, a lot of those things have been able to achieve. One thing that's still on the list that's worth mentioning is labour hire licensing. Now, this might be less relevant with the Same Job, Same Pay amendments that were made, may have less relevance, but certainly where we last left this, it was with the states to devise a scheme. Our good old Queensland government changed recently and has put a bit of a spanner in the works with the Crucifoli government saying, we don't want this to be with Victoria. Albanese in the past has said, or the government has said, look, if the states can't agree, we'll come up with our own scheme and legislate. So at the moment, it's still on the agenda. Yep. It's there as a definite push. Whether we'll actually see that happen, I think in the next government is going to be interesting. But yeah, having this concept of national providers and not just traditional labour hire companies having to have a licence and their operation in Australia, dependent on that licence, pretty big change, and also big change for hosts who have to make sure that whoever they're engaging has a licence. That's sort of, again, coming back to systems and change, making sure that that's in place is going to be interesting. But certainly going to be an interesting next year, I think, as everyone waits with bated breath for May 3rd. But as always, we'd love to hear feedback from you, our listeners, and suggestions on content for future episodes. So please let us know via LinkedIn or email insideir@hsf.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again in our next episode of Inside IR.